that, I will turn you over to my colleague Tom Dodson, who I think a lot of you have had a chance to see present before and know what a great presenter he is. And I felt guilty hitting him up again, but Tom seems to know so much about so much that is relevant to us as librarians technically that I couldn't restrain myself. Tom?
Thanks, Reinhard. Thanks, everyone, for coming. So we're going to talk about ebooks and the tools you can use to make your own if that's something you're interested in doing. I thought it would be, I'm going to talk about a number of different tools, both for previewing and for cracking EPUBs open and for editing them and things like that. So I thought it just would make sense to have a single link to a page with all of those resources. You may have already received that via email, but I link out to everything that I'm going to talk about in this talk. So I'd like to start with just a sort of a straw poll. How many of you have read an ebook in the last year? Do you mind raising your hands? Okay, a lot. We're blowing the curve. How many of you own either a dedicated e-reader like a Kindle or a Nook, or a tablet like an iPad on which you have installed an application that will read ebooks? Pretty much almost everyone in the room. And those of you who have those devices, only two more questions. How many of you read on that device more than once a week? Okay. And how many would you say read on that device on a daily basis? Okay. So in April 2012, the Pew Research folks did a survey of ebooks, ebook readers, and let's see how we compare. So 21% of Americans have read an ebook in the last year. We're well above that figure, I think, although we've self-selected, I guess. 29% of Americans age 18 or older own at least one specialized device for ebook reading. 86% of e-reader owners have read on the device more than once a week. 51% of e-reader owners read on their device on a daily basis. So as librarians and readers and potential publishers, this is a group of this is an area that we should be paying attention to. Also, when they asked these questions in April of 2012, but they also asked about, they compared it to some data from before, and so there are now 4 times more people reading ebooks on a typical day than there were in 2010. And those readers have some interesting characteristics. Device owners read more often and are more likely, not less, to buy books in all formats. Those who own ebook readers and tablets are avid readers of books in hard copy and in ebook. So it's not so much a question of, print versus digital for them, either or, it's both and. So I thought we'd start by talking about what is an ebook. Technically, it's really anything that you can read on a digital device. It could be a PDF. It certainly could be an EPUB. It's any number of things. However, the vast majority of ebooks that people actually read on their e-readers fall into 3 file formats. The first one of these is EPUB, and it's the sort of generic vanilla form of an ebook. And it's a standard that's been adopted by Apple, Barnes & Noble with their Nook, and many other makers of ebook devices. So, for example, Sony, even though they have a smaller market share, they're still a player. They're also supporting EPUB. And specifically, what I'm talking about today is going to be EPUB 2.0. There is a new version of the EPUB standard, EPUB 3.0. I'll talk about that at the very end. But pretty much all of there's only only the Apple devices are running those, and only Apple's distributing them. You can read them on, there's an extension for Google Chrome that I'll show you that allows you to read EPUB 2. And there's some additional media features that go with that. But for the most part, EPUB 2 is what people are using. Essentially what it is a specialized mini website that's designed for, with a bunch of files bundled together that's designed to be read on an e-reader. So if you already have a background in HTML and CSS, I think you'll discover that almost all of those skills transfer right over into the production of EPUB, especially if you have strong CSS skills in a design context. You'll find that incredibly useful. There's another format out there, which is called Mobi. That's what it was originally called. Amazon sort of branded it. Their particular version is called ACW, but everybody just calls it Mobi. Mobi is for the e-ink readers, the black and white Kindle readers, for the most part. And as someone who's made ebooks and people I've talked to, it's kind of it's definitely the black sheep of this family because it doesn't do things like drop caps. There's a variety of things that you can do in plain old EPUB which actually are more difficult to do in the Mobi format. And in a lot of ways, I think the appropriate analogy is Microsoft's Internet Explorer and every other browser, where you're the market leader. You have a huge share of the market. You just say, I'm going to just do whatever I want, and other people are just going to have to design for two formats and code for two formats because I can do that. So I think ebook designers are really hoping that format will go away because it doesn't make a lot of sense to have to. It just makes more work for everyone. But maybe it'll stay. They have such a big share of the market they can kind of do what they want. Recently, they've introduced a new format alongside their Kindle Fire. This was in October 2011. Amazon announced Kindle Format 8, or KF8. It's actually pretty interesting. As I said, it powers the Kindle Fire device, and it includes new features like support for HTML5. I don't know if anybody was here for the HTML5 talk that Reinhard and I gave, but they're bringing in that kind of semantic markup. They're bringing in the media support, and you get the ability to have an ebook that actually has audio and video embedded in it. CSS3, which provides you transparencies, font embedding, a variety of different things. Drop caps, which Mobi doesn't have. You can actually implement that. And fixed layouts. So I'm not going to talk about fixed layouts yet because, in a way, the thing that defines EPUB 2.0 and the kind of EPUBs that most of us are looking at now is that they have fluid layouts as opposed to fixed layouts. But there is a move towards, there are both market reasons and technical reasons why some people are making fixed layout EPUBs, but that's not the norm. So I was talking to a friend of mine who's a book designer, a print book designer, and one of the things that she designs a lot are poetry books. And she's a great graphic artist. She's has a very clear vision of how she wants things to look on the page. And she's absolutely not a Luddite. But nevertheless, I've talked to her about EPUBs twice, just casually, and she said to me, why do we have to make EPUBs? Let's just make PDFs. PDFs are great. Like, they do everything I want them to do. And the difference, and I sort of agree with that because I like working in InDesign and tools like that for print. I like that kind of control. But it's really a kind of designer-centric format compared to the ebook when it comes to reading on a smaller device or an e-reader. So, what she and I both like about PDFs is that, we can perfectly reproduce more or less the print design. Choice of typeface, line breaks exactly where we want them, which is pretty important in poetry. Positioning of photos and other graphic elements. I don't have to worry about where the text is going to be. If I want the text to be, one pica away from the image, I can do that very easily. And when I convert it to PDF, it's going to retain those proportions. Proportions of the text block, like if you're designing a print book, you're thinking about things like how much space between the text block and either side. You're thinking about how many characters per line are an optimal reading for a novel versus a technical text. You're thinking about all of those things. Well, you sort of have to forget all of that, or just accept that you no longer, accept that there are things you cannot change. The reader can change them with an EPUB. So why don't we take a look at, let's look at an EPUB. Actually, let's look at first at a PDF of a something that I've been working on called the Best Indie Lit New England. It's an anthology of some of the best fiction and poetry that's been published in independent magazines in New England. And this is a story called Riddle. So here I've got the nice header, and I'm using the font that I want to use. The lines are exactly as long as I want them to be. But if you're on a small device and you want to, I need to really kind of get in there and see that, this isn't really the best way to read this. You're going to get tired of that pretty quick, that horizontal scrolling. You're going to get tired of the vertical scrolling to get to the next part of it. So it's not really ideal for, it's not really an ideal reading experience, unless you're reading it in print or maybe on a desktop. So let's take a look at, this is an e-reader, this is an EPUB version of the same story, except that it's, I'm showing it in, this is Adobe Digital Editions, which is the sort of generic desktop e-reader. So if you're somebody who reads a lot of e-readers on your desktop, and a lot of people do, you might use this. Certainly it's a good thing to review your EPUBs in as part of your workflow, because it's not as specialized as some of the others. It's pretty predictable. If it works in digital editions, it's probably going to work on the other platforms. So let's look at one of the differences here. I have this option to say, I want this to be ultra large. So we can't do that with a PDF, at least not in this manner. So notice that one after another, Donna trudged by these and other, and let's look here. One after another, Donna trudged by these and other scenes as she, so here it's breaking the line at the appropriate place. It's word wrapping, so that if I make the text bigger, if I spread out the view or make the view smaller, the text is wrapping. So that's one of the things that might drive a print designer crazy, but because if you really want your design to look exactly as it would on a printed page, but it's very useful for a reader on a small device, or maybe someone who doesn't see that well and really needs that text to be bigger. The other thing I'll point out, let's see, I don't know if I can do it with Adobe Digital Editions. Well, let me point this out. So PDFs can have tables of contents. They don't have to, but all EPUBs, as part of the format, all ebooks in these three formats do. And this is called the navigational table of contents. And in most devices, there's basically just a button or something like that, or it's something that you touch to get to the navigational table of contents so that you can easily jump around the document. And then finally, I want to look at, this is actually so Kindle, Amazon makes a desktop application for reading ebooks, but they also make something called Kindle Previewer, and that's what this is. This is more for, you're making an EPUB and you want to know what it's going to look like on Kindle devices. You'd use this, whereas if you're a casual reader and you just want to read the thing, you might use their, you want to read a Mobi file, you might use the Kindle desktop viewer. So I'm using this to see what is this thing what's it going to look like in a Kindle Fire. And so this is what it's more or less what it's going to look like in a Kindle Fire. Notice it's keeping my, I chose this particular kind of typeface, and I'm very attached to it. I chose it because it was done by a New England type designer, and there's all these reasons why I chose it. So, and it's respecting that. The font's actually embedded. Let's see, not there. Let's switch to, so this is pretty good, but let's switch to Kindle e-ink, the kind of traditional Kindle. And we get something quite different. The typeface selection is totally different. And the user might say, let's see, let me go to actually, let's go here. Font size, the same choice. They can make it really big. They can make it really small, which is going to change the text wrap. They can also say, this says publisher's font, but it's actually not respecting the font I embedded, because it's a Kindle Mobi file. But if they wanted to, choose some font like Palatino, they can do that. If they want to read it in Helvetica, they can do that. So those are kind of some of the main differences. So let's say, something weird like Futura gives it a totally different look and feel. And so again, a print designer is going to be like, no, Futura suggests modernism and all of these other, and Bauhaus, and this book is about the Middle Ages. It would be, it would be heresy to put this into some kind of modernist font. The user can just say, yeah, whatever, I don't care. I like reading things in Futura, so I'm going to read things in Futura. So it really empowers the reader, but it, as I said, kind of drives print designers a little crazy. So this is just a kind of quick rundown of those comparisons between, one format and another. I think it's instructive. So EPUB, you can reflow the text wrap on the fly. PDF, the text doesn't reflow when it's enlarged. EPUB, the reader often controls not only the font size, but also the font style. In a PDF, usually those things are fixed. In a PDF, to read the thing, you have to scroll down it vertically. In the EPUB format, you're going to usually have some sort of arrow or hand swipe to turn the page. One place where EPUBs kind of fall down in this comparison is image positioning. It's difficult with the text kind of constantly wrapping and changing position to have it wrap around your images in the ways you might like. So that can be difficult to implement. Whereas, with PDFs, if you have an image-rich, text, it's very easy to make sure that those relationships, spatial relationships, maintain the same. Also, with an EPUB, I don't mention here, but different devices are going to display things differently. And you're probably going to have to make multiple versions if you want to distribute it with multiple resellers for multiple devices. So, for example, making an EPUB for a Nook device, you usually need to add a sort of set, you read their guidelines, you have to add like so many pixels border around everything. I mean, it's not terribly difficult, but if you don't do that, all of a sudden you're not going to understand why all of your text is flush against the left and right margin. Or, for example, that the Mobi format doesn't support drop caps, like that P on the peaches that was bigger than the rest of the text. It doesn't support that well. So one of the things that I would say is that if you're interested in making ebooks, not interested in having a very frustrating experience, and you're using this EPUB 2 format, I would say think about what kind of thing you want to make. It's very suitable for things like text-heavy books like novels, things containing mainly prose, perfect for an EPUB. Not really so great for an EPUB would be like an illustrated children's book, a comic book, a travel book, a cookbook, things that are going to be image-heavy, photo-heavy. I would not choose that as your first EPUB project, your first ebook project. So, an EPUB, we're going to start with EPUB. The reason I'm using EPUB and ebook kind of interchangeably is EPUB is usually what most people start with, and then you run it through some kind of converter to have it spit out the KF8 and the Mobi file. So when I say EPUB, that's why we're focusing on EPUB 2, because that's really what you're going to be making. And then you're going to worry later about how to transfer it smoothly to these other file formats. But basically what it is it's a compressed file. It's a collection of files that make up the EPUB. It's like a mini website. So when you crack it open, this is what you'd see. The first thing to point out is this MIME type, which if you've worked with media files at all, you'll be familiar with. It's basically a one-line file. We won't even look at it. It's a one-line file that just says, hey, this collection of folders and documents and things, this is an EPUB. The next thing, the meta-INF folder doesn't have a lot in it. Sometimes all it will have in it is a single file called container.xml, and it's an XML file, and it just tells the EPUB reader where to find essentially the home page of the EPUB. Then there might be other files in meta-INF. So, for example, I've got one there called com.apple.ibooks.displayoptions.xml. That's if you're putting your thing in the Apple bookstore and you want to use embedded fonts, you have to have a file with that name in it with a certain line of code that says, hey, iBooks, this thing has an embedded font in it. Speaking of embedded fonts, if you've chosen to do that, it adds a layer of complexity, so a lot of times it's just not worth doing. In the case of this particular publication, I cared a lot about the typeface choices. But you may also not have the rights to freely distribute those typefaces, those fonts. So if they're not sort of open source or you don't have the right license based on what you purchased, if they're purchased fonts, then you might have to encrypt them. And so you might see a file, if you download some fancy EPUB and crack it open on your desktop, you may discover that there's some file in there that's an encryption kind of key for that. But kind of the real action is happening in this folder called OEBPS, and that stands for Open eBook Publication Structure. but I'm just going to be referring to it as the book folder, because that's really where the book part of the ebook lives. So I think the easiest thing is, so we were looking a moment ago at this Best Indie New England book in Adobe Digital Editions. So now let's look at it sort of cracked open. I usually have an icon here, but I don't have right now. So just a second. Dropbox. While I'm hunting for this, I've got it right here. But at this point, does anybody have any questions right off the bat? Sure.
Is there an EPUB editor, or what would you use to make this?
Yes, there are several of them, and that's once we go through the file thing, that's the next thing I want to do. Yes. There's some that are specialized for it. I end up, if you're already doing HTML, XML, and CSS, you may find that it's just as comfortable for you to work in the code editor you use to make web apps and things like that, and websites. So this is called Byline B9 because I was doing a bunch of iterations, because each time I'm validating it, make sure I haven't broken anything from the previous iteration, and I'll talk about workflow. But so here's the OE BPS, or the book folder, and you'll see in here there's a folder called image or images, and so here's the cover of the book. There's also a little icon that's a thing that I'm using as an end mark at the end of a story or things like that. So, any images associated with it. There's also some other resources. So fonts, if you've embedded any fonts, this if you're used to fonts, these will be TTF, OTF. These are familiar formats. It's always going to have at least one, in my case I usually just use one CSS file, so one cascading style sheet, the exact same language that's used to handle presentation in websites, so in websites to determine what's the font, how big is it, what's the layout going to look like. All of that's determined here using exactly the same language and rules and syntax that you'd use for a website or any other application that uses CSS styling. And then you've got all of these files, like, in this case, named whatever they're named, that are just XHTML files. So it uses if you're not familiar with XHTML, the best way to think about it is, the elementary way is, it's just stricter HTML. You have to close tags. It's a stricter standard based on XML. But if you know how to work with HTML, you know how to work with these files. Actually, let's take a quick look at one of these. I'm going to open this up in a text editor that I tend to use, Sublime. So, if you're familiar with HTML, this will look very familiar. Head, body, H2 with classes, divs, paragraph tags. So really, that's all this is. It's these lists of files, and they're broken up into different files essentially as section breaks. So each one of these is a single story or a single poem in this collection. It could be chapters in your book, and I'll talk more about how that gets broken down. But essentially, each file is a section of the book. Now, there are a couple of files that are unique to EPUBs that you might not have encountered before. One of them is called toc.ncx, and so and here's what this does. So when I pull up this navigational table of contents, which all the e-readers are just going to have a button or something to get to, that's what that file does. It provides the text and the links that are going to go here. So if we look at that, it's actually an XML file, despite the weird ending .ncx. So like one of the things that I'll do, this is Sublime. I'll go to my text editor, Sublime, and say, you know what? I want you to know that this is an XML file. And when I do that, it's going to color code it for me. It knows, oh, okay, I know XML. So this is a tag, and this is content. And so, but basically, if we look at this, it's a series of what are called nav points with labels, and those are just saying, here what word should be in the table of contents. Here's a list of everything in the table of contents and links to it. So that's actually pretty straightforward, but you might need to come in here and mess around with some stuff if you end up, for example, if you auto-generate this from an EPUB from some editor or something, or like, Apple Pages, and we'll talk about that. If you spit it out from a converter or something, you may want to rename some things. So you might end up coming in here and oh, I don't want, it took the header from my chapter heading, which included a subheading, and it put them, and that's what it called this section of the book. I only wanted to call it part of that. That's much too long. So, you might have reasons to come in here and change this. The other file is a file called content.opf, and it is also an XML file. Does anyone, or perhaps most of you, recognize, can you see there what those tags are? If you can't see it, DC : title, familiar. So it's Dublin Core. So Dublin Core is used for the metadata description of an EPUB. So, and it's actually I know it's difficult to see for those of you who are physically here in this light, but so this section is the metadata section, opens with a metadata tag, closes with a metadata tag, and inside it is essentially Dublin Core. The next section is something called the manifest. The manifest, as the name implies, is a list of every file in the EPUB when it's zipped up. So it's going to list all of your fonts if you've embedded them. It's going to list the CSS file. It's going to list the individual XHTML files. It lists everything. And EPUB, you're going to have to validate, run through a validator at some point. Your validator is going to be very upset if anything is missing. If you end up changing files or renaming files or things like that, you're going to get in the habit of always going back to content.opf and making sure that the manifest accurately reflects everything that is or isn't there. You might throw something away and you have to take it out, or it's not going to validate. Then there's the spine, and this essentially, I think it's exactly how it says. It basically tells the e-reader what order should these files be. So, for example, in this, these numbers, ebook 19, ebook 20, ebook 21, the e-reader doesn't know anything. Just because I happen to name them that doesn't mean anything. I could put 20 before 24 or after, it doesn't matter. But this says, if I have an ebook and I'm going, tapping through rather than using the navigational table of contents, what file comes next? So in this one, for example, I added a couple of files, one called contributors and one called mags. Mags is a list of the magazines that are represented in this particular EPUB. And so I tagged them onto the end, whereas originally it had been one whole single file that I threw away, and I put two new ones and then I added them here. And then finally, this is called the guide section, and essentially it answers questions like, so where's the cover page? Where's the copyright statement? Where does the text actually start after all of this, like thanks and acknowledgments? Where does this start? So different resellers will require different things in the guide section. So for example, I think it's Apple that requires other.intro, and if it's not there, even if your EPUB validates the code is correct, if it's missing one of these elements, your reseller will spit it back and say, no, we're not taking it. So, so that's something that sort of EPUB building is EPUBs are a hard mistress. You really have to get everything exactly right. So I'm under the assumption that what you're most interested in doing is using existing tools to produce EPUBs yourself. However, I should point out that there are vendors who will do it for you from some other format to EPUB if it seems sort of overwhelming or it's just not worth your time, but you still want to sort of be in the ebook game. So one of those is Smashwords. Smashwords you have to give them a Word document. You give them a Word document set up according to the specifications that they have, and they will then produce an ebook and distribute it to the major ebook retailers. It's free, but what they'll do is they'll take a cut, 10% cut of sales from their partners and a 50% cut of sales made on their own website. So a lot of people choose to do that who don't, who maybe have no background in code and no real interest in going forward with that. Lulu.com will convert PDFs and Word documents to ebooks. they will charge you somewhere, depending on the kind of file it is, the complexity of it, and the length, somewhere between $290 and $400. So I would advise against that. You can probably find someone who knows HTML who will do it for a lot less than that. Amazon's Kindle Direct Publishing, it's a little foggy. I'm a little foggy on the details. I need to probably look into it a little bit more, because I know that, so basically if you want to sell your book only in the Kindle store, they will convert a Word file to the Kindle format, both Mobi and KF8, for free. Creating an account is free. But it's my understanding, this is the part I'm foggy about, it's my understanding you're sort of locked in to only selling it in the Kindle store. You'll want to investigate that more than I have, because I'm kind of not interested in going that route. What I expect most of us are going to do are use applications to take a file from some format. Well, so let me state that first. It's my assumption that you're not going to want to hand code a novel. Maybe you will. Maybe coding is like such a second nature to you that like just, and all these sort of like grep searches and things like that, to insert tags instead of having to do them by hand, that it just makes sense to do it that way. Most of us, that's not the case. And most of us who are making ebooks, we didn't write the original document in that format, or the client didn't give it to us in that format. So most of the time you're going to be working with conversion applications. If you're a Mac user and you have iWork, Pages will export directly to EPUB. Now all of these formats, pretty much I can't think of one where you're not going to have to crack the thing open and make changes. But at least if you've got your novel as a Word document, you convert it to Pages, or you've got it as an original Pages document, you can export it to EPUB and have a really good starting place. There's, I always want to call it Calibre, but it's Calibre. It's a free and open source ebook library management application. It was pretty much one of the earlier ones. It's used by a lot of people to organize their libraries. However, it has the feature of converting a large number of formats to a large number of formats. It'll automatically detect and create book structures, like break it up into multiple files, like chapters. It'll create a table of contents. It'll insert the necessary metadata. It doesn't convert Word documents directly, though, which I find a little surprising. But it does convert from rich text format. So it does from RTF. So if you can still keep your formatting, just export your Word document into RTF, and then export it using Calibre. And then tell me if it works, because I haven't done it. But supposedly that's supposed to be pretty easy to get your kind of base EPUB. It'll also handle HTML and PDFs. However, I like what they say on their in their manual. They say, quote, PDF is a terrible format to convert from. And for the reasons that we talked about, that makes sense. It probably, if you're, they're fundamentally different philosophies of how to present a document. And they basically have a page dedicated to all of the things you can expect to go wrong if you export from PDF. So, but if you're writing a novel, you've probably, or something like that, you've probably got the text in some kind of word processor. And the last one I want to mention is Adobe InDesign. It's part of Adobe's Creative Suite. This happens to be what I use. I would say it's probably the industry standard publishing application for print publications and interactive PDFs and things like that. So it has a lot of features that designers really value, like powerful layout and typesetting tools. You can adjust kerning like at a very micro level between pieces of type. Tools for integrating artwork into designs, user-defined styles. One of the things I like about how Adobe InDesign does its export is instead of sort of going into, when you're working in InDesign, you don't generally go in, if you're proficient in InDesign, you're not going in there and like highlighting a header and manually changing all the settings. You create a style with all of those settings, and you apply it to every header in the document. The nice thing about an exporting from Adobe InDesign is it will write CSS based on what you've named your styles. So if this is a paragraph style, this font, at this, et cetera, all these characteristics, it'll translate all of that into CSS when it spits it out. It's not pretty. I mean, you're going to want to go in there and clean that code up, but it's a really good place to start if you're very sort of fussy as I am about how it's going to look. So it also features the ability to automatically create a navigational table of contents. If your first page is image heavy, is basically a single image, it can rasterize that and make it automatically as a cover for you. It'll break up the content into separate files based on your styles. So if you can tell it every time you encounter header style, that's make that a new section in the ebook. So it makes it easy to kind of plan ahead while you're doing your document in InDesign what it's going to output to. And it may also just be my bias because that's what I've been working in. So I'll mention a couple of other tools, but and they're linked from the resources page, but I'm not going to go into any depth on them. One is Apple's iBooks Author, and it's only for making iBooks for the iPad, and another one, Adobe's Digital Publisher Suite, which is also only for making iBooks for the iPad. And they also, I'm going to talk briefly about fixed format. They also do this kind of fixed format thing. So if you really do want to make a cookbook, you really do want to make a comic book and put it as an ebook, you're probably going to be wanting to do a fixed layout format, and one of those two tools might be useful for you. Okay. So if did I answer your question about where you start? We haven't talked about editing them, though, like actually creating. So I'll get to that in a moment. Okay. Before you even get to editing, though, you're going to want to preview your output from one of these platforms, InDesign or Calibre, not Calibre, or whatever it is, on a desktop. And there's a couple of reasons for doing that. You may not have all of the devices. You may not have any of them. You might have to borrow, eventually you're going to want to borrow one from somebody and see what it looks like on a Kindle and things like that, even though, you might get by with previewers and things like that in the short term. But there's another reason, which is that 42% of all readers of ebooks actually read them on their desktops, not on these other devices. So it's good to know that your EPUB is going to function effectively for someone who's using a reader of that kind. So we saw Adobe Digital Editions. That's again the kind of plain vanilla variety, and it's a good kind of. It also a lot of libraries and companies who use digital rights management use Adobe's digital rights management. So a lot of their stuff will initially open in Adobe Digital Editions or something like that, and then the reader might be like, oh, I don't want to use that reader, I want to use a different one. But there's a lot. It's kind of ubiquitous. Calibre, in addition to doing this great file conversion, was also used by a lot of early adopters of ebooks and allows you to organize them into libraries and things like that. And so a lot of people use it just for reading. One thing about converting from Calibre that I should have mentioned is that sometimes it'll introduce some kind of wonky code that you don't want. And so sometimes when you're trying to validate your EPUB, it might cause problems. So I actually am not sure Calibre is your best choice for making EPUBs, but it's a good reader. Bookall, which is a really kind of Mac, is kind of very simple Mac-only standard ebook reader. Firefox, if you use the Firefox browser, you can go and get a plugin that allows you to open EPUB files that you have on your machine or from wherever, and it functions as an e-reader. So it has the built-in navigational TOC and all of that kind of stuff. And finally, I'll mention again, all of these are linked from that main link. IBIS Reader, if you want to read an EPUB and you don't want to install anything on your machine, let's say you're at, I don't know, a library, or you work at a library and they won't let you install anything, and you want to read an EPUB on your break, you can upload EPUBs to the IBIS website, and they will allow you to read them in their reader. One thing to note, none of these all support the EPUB 2 format, none of them support the newer EPUB 3 format. There are also simulators. So I make a distinction between desktop readers, which the people who make them assume you're a user who's just using them to read stuff on your desktop. Then there are simulators, which are also free. All these are free for download, and which are for really developers to test. And so you can download Nook for Mac or PC to see what it's going to look like on a Barnes & Noble Nook device. You can download Kindle Previewer, which is what we were looking at in earlier, because we wanted to see how it's going to look in a Kindle Fire and an e-ink reader. There's currently no desktop software that lets you proof how something's going to look in the iOS reader iBooks. You basically have to have an iPad, or you have to have an iPad. It's not, you can't just build that into part of your workflow to check beforehand. So you've previewed it. We're still not ready to edit it. You're going to want to validate it. You're going to want to make sure, like, for example, if you did a conversion in Calibre, you want to make sure Calibre produced, or Pages or InDesign produced an EPUB that will pass validation. So validation is simply submitting your EPUB to a program that checks against some standards that were established by the International Digital Publishing Forum, or IDPF. All of the major resellers require that EPUBs adhere to this rule, so if it doesn't validate, they won't take it. They may have other things too, like they have a guide section and things like that, but they definitely won't take it if it doesn't validate. So think of this as like the IDPF is like the W3C. You have to do it the way that they want you to. And it's pretty easy to check. There's a software called EPUB Check. Again, there's a link to that. It's command line though, so if you don't like typing text commands, to make things happen, that's kind of annoying. They have a free online validation tool if you're not doing like 100 of them, and if each individual file is not more than 10 megabytes. It'll tell you if you have any errors, where the errors are, what file and what lines it's in. And finally, if you have a Mac, you can use this Apple script called EPUB Check 2 that has been developed. And I just have it here, EPUB Check. Well, I have a different version. Basically, I can drag any EPUB onto that and just let go, and it will tell me, it'll take a minute, and it'll tell me if there are any errors, where they are, or if it's valid. So now editing EPUBs. So the first thing you might ask is, why would I want to go in and do that at all? If these conversion tools are good enough, why should I have to mess with that? Well, there's a number of reasons. Your EPUB doesn't validate. You have to go in and says, well, what is wrong with this file at line 25? And figure it out and fix it. Maybe there's something that you can just change. Sometimes, like InDesign and other programs, if you are a coder, it may produce markup that makes you crazy. Maybe either aesthetic or technical reason that you're just like, that is just gross, I need to fix that. Because maybe you're going to work with that markup later. Maybe you're going to use that same markup in a subsequent ebook. The same way you can reuse a CSS style sheet. You might have a reason to make sure that that's markup that you can work with. You may need to add elements required by resellers. So it may be a perfectly valid EPUB, but you need to add some stuff into those files that resellers are going to require. And that might be, so one thing that a lot of resellers require is an internal table of contents. In addition to the navigational table of contents, they want a separate page, an XHTML file, that just has a set of links, a kind of double table of contents. And so sometimes that's required. Apple requires a guide section. This is the case in this most recent one that I did. InDesign broke up the sections in a certain way that made sense, but I wanted a couple of other breaks. And I wanted those breaks to be represented in the navigational table of contents, so I needed to basically cut a single XHTML document into 3 new documents, and then tell the manifest that it had 3 documents instead of 1, and then wrap it up again, things like that. So there's some different reasons why you want to do that. Edit the CSS style sheet. Maybe you just decide you're a good CSS coder and you want to go in and either fix some things using your CSS style, or you want to change the way it looks. I put a link on the list of resources to. You're going to be familiar with something called CSS Zen Garden. There's an EPUB version of that. So if you wanted to take a look at some templates that other people have done, CSS files that you might want to apply to your own books. It might just be instructive to look at them and see what people have done, even if you don't end up. But you can also just download it, and assuming your classes and things are named the same way, you can apply it to your own document. And of course, fixing layout problems. So if you have any kind of situation where you're exporting, where you've got a text box and a certain distance away another text box, and a certain distance away another text box, which is a quite common way of doing things in InDesign, like you're working with a grid. When you spit that, it's just going to put them all on top of each other. So I'll often go into fix vertical layout problems. So I know we need editors, but before that, you've got an EPUB or a MOBI file. So let's say EPUB. You've got an EPUB, you don't get it in that nice sort of format with all the different folders and things like that. You have a single something called .epub. So what you need to do is you're going to need to crack it open. To do that, it's very easy on a PC. You just change the EPUB extension to .zip, and you unzip it. And then when you're done, you zip it, but you compress it again back up to zip, and you change it back to EPUB, and you're done. So that's pretty easy. Doesn't work on a Mac. There's an EPUB forum, and there's a programmer named Dan Rodney who built a couple of scripts that do this job beautifully, and I provided a link to the forum where he posted those. I'll give you a quick example of what that looks like. So let me go to my Finder. I've got this thing called byline v1 EPUB. I'm just going to drag it onto his script, which I've put down here, EPUB unzip, let go, and there's byline v1 all broken down. And when I'm done, I can just drag it back onto the EPUB zip, and it'll zip it back up for me. The only thing I would do differently is I would call it something else. I would rename that unzip folder like V2 so that I don't lose my original, and then I would rezip it and have it so it would save it as V2 and then proceed. That's just basically how my workflow goes. So you've got it cracked open. Hopefully it's already validating. You can use any code editor you would normally use for a web, for XHTML and for CSS. They'll work just fine. I was using a moment ago, I was demonstrating it with Sublime. And I put a link in the resources to a number of different common editors. So if you already have a favorite editor, I would say just use that. The other thing you could do is you might use, if you like using Dreamweaver, I would say go ahead and use that too. That's probably fine. Dreamweaver also has some tools in it for like site-wide link checking that you can also use. I've never done it, but people have told me you can also use those tools to check and see if things are in the manifest, or if all your links in the table of contents that you've built separate from the navigational POC are going to the right places and things like that. So that can be useful. I generally find Dreamweaver to be like way kind of burdensome and have a bunch of stuff in it I don't need, but some people really like it. Text Wrangler is a free code editor that people use for websites and things like that. But one of the things about Text Wrangler, I don't know if it's true of others, but I have observed about Text Wrangler. If you drag an EPUB on the Mac over Text Wrangler, or you open an EPUB in Text Wrangler, it won't, I don't believe it actually breaks it apart, but it basically shows you the EPUB as if it were broken apart. So that's a nice feature if you don't want to have to constantly crack open and uncrack. You can go, you can just drop it onto, you can save individual pieces and then close it. You still got your EPUB with the changes you made. Then there is a specialized editor designed just for ebooks, and it's called Sigil. It's a dedicated code editor for EPUBs. It's multi-platform. It has multiple views, so like you can look at the book view, the code view, the preview view, which is nice. It has a table of contents generator, a metadata editor, so you can just sort of like fill in fields for the metadata instead of actually going in and doing the Dublin core stuff. It spell checks. It has its own integrated EPUB validator called Flight Crew. So you just basically, whenever you're ready, you check a button and then it'll go through and do a validation for you. For whatever reason, I don't use it, but people do use it and like it. So those are the different, and the other thing I'll mention, when you've got it broken down into its component parts, into its XHTML files, you're probably going to want to review how you're going, oh, I changed this CSS rule, how does it look? You don't need to pack it back up and look at it in the EPUB right away. If you're just checking that sort of stuff, not validation, you can open it in a web browser. It's an XHTML file. Just like any other HTML file, it will open in a browser. You can see, like, for example, what you're checking is not does the navigational table of contents work, but rather something like, did this drop cap work? Something that's just about, that could display on a website that's not integral to EPUB per se. You can certainly review your work as you go in a browser. So I'm going to wrap up by talk about workflow and then really briefly about the future. But basically, it's a painful process. it's a lot of doing things over and over again, at least the way I do it. So, converting from a source file to an EPUB, validating that EPUB, reviewing it in Adobe Digital Editions or something like that, one of these e-readers. Make corrections in the source application. This is usually my first step, and that's why I'm calling it pre-processing. If there's something I can fix in Pages or InDesign or whatever the source is, and particularly if you're not a really strong coder, it might just be easier to do that, so that when it exports it, the problem is fixed. So you might want to consider, a couple of rounds of doing that. Repeat if necessary. Once you're ready to crack it open, I would recommend making discrete and related changes with your code editor. I would not recommend, just from experience, or unless you're a much better coder than I am, which is very possible. But I would avoid doing that, doing all changes at once. I would make discrete changes like, I want to fix drop caps throughout the document. Just because it's really difficult to figure out if, let's say, when you zip it back up and validate it, well, you will get notes about what the problems are, but you kind of don't want 50 problems and then have to go back through and try to. It's a lot easier to know what the last thing you did was, and then to be able to just fix it or go back to the previous version and know that you have all of your changes up to that point. So I would review the changes in a web browser, wrap it back up with a new name, validate it, and repeat as necessary until you've eliminated the mistakes and you've got the layout you want and everything's working the way you want it. Then you need to if you want to get it ready for resellers, you need to kind of do some post-processing. So you're going to review the vendor guidelines, or I find like lynda.com has some great EPUB courses, and there's the person there is Maria Concepcion, and she's they're constantly releasing new versions of these trainings and stuff, and she's up on all that stuff. So very often she'll be like, hey, if you're doing it for Nook, do this. But ultimately, it's a really dynamic environment, so if you really want to be on top of it all the time, you just keep going back to the guidelines and making sure that you've got it right for the Nook store, got it right for the Apple store. I would say create a copy of your core EPUB that you already hit exactly the way you want. It validates, it works. It works in Adobe Digital Editions. I would create a copy of that and rename it something like, Barnes & Noble EPUB. Or crack it open, make the changes you need to make with a code editor, review those changes in a web browser, wrap it up, validate it, review in simulators, and appropriate devices that you can get your hands on. So if you're making it for Kindle, that's your primary audience, find somebody who's got a Kindle and check it out. Review it on your Kindle previewer first, because then you can immediately go in and make changes. You don't have to wait on that. But once it's ready, you'll want to look at it in your real device. It's a lot like mobile development in that respect. And repeat, because you might need to do that more than once to get it to work or to get it accepted. So just a quick mention of distribution. Once you've got a validating EPUB or a Mobi or a Kindle Fire 8 or whatever in the right format, it's relatively easy to just upload it and wait 24 hours and it's up and available for sale. But it's helpful to know where to put it. Amazon, 38% of the sales of ebooks are coming from Amazon, so you want it on Amazon. A lot of people are selling them on their own site. It's a file, you put it up on your site, you put it up an EPUB file, and a Mobi file, and a K file, maybe all three, and then you just maybe one that's tweaked to work best with the Nook, and you have an e-commerce site and you sell it on your site. There's plenty of people do that. The iTunes bookstore has a much smaller kind of share, but I have a feeling that's may not always be the case. Barnes & Noble, small. Borders, Kobo. Borders didn't exist before. So you might look around and see kind of what market you're interested in being in, but I think nobody can avoid Amazon. You're going to need. That's why the Mobi format still exists. That's why the K format exists, because you sort of have to play with Amazon. So I want to talk real briefly. Do we go till 5 or 4:30? Okay. Okay. I'm going to wrap up at 4:30 and then questions. Looking towards the future, there's a lot of interest in fixed layout ebooks, which one way to think about it functionally is kind of a hybrid between the contrast I was drawing between EPUBs and PDFs. So these are for image-rich books, comics, textbooks with interactivity, things like that. It allows you to specify where the line breaks are, where the keeps are, so specify with a lot more precision that this caption should stay with this image, that sort of thing. The text, however, is still live. It's still searchable, selectable. You can superimpose it over images. The navigation is thumbnail-based. It's more visual. It's usually for more visual types of ebooks. Allows for full spread layout. So if you have a horizontal iPad, you can have a full 2-page spread that bleeds to the edge instead of cutting off. So you can do some of the kind of really nice design things you can do with a printed book. It can only be sold right now as an ebook in the Apple iBook store. And even though it's this kind of weird bastard child format, it's basically an EPUB 2 that's been really changed around in a lot of ways. If you do that, you can sell it in the iBook store, and that's one of the main reasons why people like if you're a big publisher and you're like, well, why do we want to make why would we want to do this? Apple iBook Store won't take, they're a major distribution network, and they won't take your PDFs. So if you want, to be able to offer, your textbook for download with all of its, interactivity and features and things like that, you're going to want to make it an ebook of this kind. It also can include things like narration or ambient audio. So like you could open the book to a certain page and, I don't know, it starts playing music or frog sounds or something. Interactivity with scripts, so it can actually go along and read out loud with it. Or you can, do quizzes and things like that. Then there's the EPUB 3 format, which is the next thing kind of down the pipe. And that has support for HTML5. That includes things like being able to embed media such as video and audio, support for CSS3, which allows you to do things like transparency and certain kinds of font embedding and things like that. It also has greater support for scripting, for interactivity, so you can actually kind of have like JavaScript and stuff in there, and greater support for text-to-speech. So the last sort of minute here, I'm going to show you a couple of EPUB 3s. If you have Chrome, you can get this add-on called Medium, and it's linked to from the set of links. And then you can upload things to it. Also on that link I linked to, there's a Google Code area where people are posting EPUB 3s where they're trying out some of these new features. So here's an example of something you can't do in EPUB 2.
Chapter 1, Blooming. Call me Ishmael.
So notice how it's following along for us. I can also make him go faster.
I think there no money in my purse and nothing particular interests me, I'm sure.
For a lot
I thought I would sail about a little and see the watery part of it.
So that's one of the things that could be a real feature for some people. In addition to like more sort of, that's really integrated with the text. You could of course also just like embed something, like here's a poem. If you want to hear the audio version, click here. You could do that too. This is I found this one pretty interesting. This is a book in Japanese, and one of the things that it does is very simple, but it makes sense. It goes right to left, as you would if you were reading Japanese. Also, it's fully selectable, so I can grab all these characters and do what I want with them, copy them. And also, this particular one also has that. Wait a second. It has all the same features. I can make her talk faster or slower. So that's what's coming next. I think that'll be really exciting. So I'm immediately thinking like, oh, I just have this book with fiction and poetry. I'd love to have people be able to hear poets read their own poems and have that integrated into the ebook. And so we're not there yet, but it's technically possible. It's just all the resellers have to catch up and everyone has to decide on standards and things like that. So thank you very much. That's the link to all of the resources on my site. And I'm happy to answer questions or chat with you more about EPUBs.